Hello, students. Today we're going to talk about learning and behaviors. This is chapter 6 in your book. So first, let's talk about some things that are not learned behaviors. And this chapter has a lot of different definitions, so make sure you take careful notes, use examples in those notes of things that help it click for you, so how you understand the concept. But some of these definitions are really specific, so do pay attention to those in your book. Refer back to these slides, refer back to your book to make sure that you are understanding exactly what these concepts are. So these are unlearned behaviors in our chapter on learning. So instincts are unlearned behaviors. They can be pretty complicated or complex behaviors. So geese following their parent is an example of an instinct. So a brain just driving a fly towards a smell is probably an instinct and not a learned behavior. So in humans, we do see reflexes. So we've talked about, depending on which chapter you're on and which order you're going in, we've probably already talked a little bit about reflexes in humans. So a reflex is an unlearned response. Sometimes they can be kind of complex behaviors, like multiple steps in the behavior, but this is something unlearned. It's genetically programmed into us. So for an infant, for example, we have a reflex that anything that touches an infant's face, they will move their head towards it and try to start sucking on it. So that's a very helpful reflex, especially early on in life, to be able to find a nipple to be able to feed. So that is a reflex. It's not something learned. They do that immediately. All right, with this, learning, what is learning then? If those things are not learning, they are just there, born into the individual or the organism. Learning is a systematic, relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. So this definition is a very behaviorist definition. So we'll talk about other forms of learning later on in the chapter that wouldn't necessarily fit this strict behaviorist definition, but a behaviorist is one of the fields of psychology that really focused only on observable behavior. So that's this definition down here, behaviorism. It's a theory of learning that only focuses on observable behavior. So are you raising your hand? Is your head down on a desk? How long did it take you to do a specific action, like taking out the trash? Did you do it quickly or slowly? So observable outside behavior. So a strict behaviorist doesn't really care what's going on inside your brain. So this little meme here, the behaviorist doesn't care what is happening in your brain. As we've gone on since that time, obviously we do care about what's going on inside your brain and how your neurons are related to learning and memory and all those kinds of things. But from the starting point, these first couple things we'll start with, the strict behaviorists didn't care about what was going on in your brain, mostly because at the time that this field of study started, they didn't really have any access to what was going on inside the brain. And they didn't think it was trustworthy to ask people questions about their own internal experiences as well. So, for a behaviorist, learning is a systematic, relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through the lifespan. So, a relatively permanent change in behavior for my cats is that they used to not do this in my previous house. They used to not scratch on my door at night. They would actually scratch on my kids' doors, but now they will also scratch on my door at night now. And part of that is because they have learned that they can come into my room here at this house. In my previous house, I didn't let them into my room. There were like it was not a good place for cats to be able to go. It was like connected to the laundry room. We usually kept it open, and that was not a safe place for cats. Anyway, point is, they have learned since moving to our new house that they can come into the room and they have a relatively permanent behavior, hopefully it goes away, that they will scratch on my door at night because they want to come in. So with that being said, that is the behaviorist definition of learning. Another big piece of behaviorist definitions and conditioning that we'll be talking about is associative learning. And this is associations. So when you hear associations, think of connections. So you're making connections between two events. So something happens and you connect it to something else. That's making an association. So observational learning, which we'll get to at the end of the chapter, this is learning from other people's or imitating other people's behavior. So we'll watch a little video about the Bobo doll later on in the lecture. But associations are basically what all of these learning bits are about. And so for a strict behaviorist, you are observing a behavior. This sound has happened, and now you see this behavior happening. happening. You have clearly associated those two things because I observed the behavior. We know now that one of the processes that's happening in your mind is that there are neural connections being made between those two things that are happening at the same time. But again, to a strict behaviorist, they don't care about what's going on into your brain. All right, so with this, we'll talk a lot about conditioning today, both classical and operant conditioning, but conditioning itself is just the process of making that association. Again, lots of definitions. We have associative learning is learning by making associations. Conditioning is what we call the process of coming to those associations. So classical conditioning is like this upper example here. There is a stimulus and you have a behavior and they are associated with each other, but there's no action on your part or the organism's part or the dog's part. So operant conditioning is active. You do something and you have a consequence and you associate the behavior with the consequence. That might be a reinforcing consequence, make it more likely that you do it again, or a punishing consequence that makes it less likely you will do that behavior again. So classical conditioning is what we saw from Pavlov's dogs. So let's watch this little video about Pavlov and his dogs. One interesting thing that you might not know, because it's usually talked about as a bell, he actually did some of the first experiments with a metronome. So let's watch that video about Pavlov, well, some of the video anyway, about Pavlov and his dogs right now.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow.
He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food.
So this is a reflex. This is something that is unlearned at this point. So the dogs, when their tongues touch the food, they have the reflex to drool, and their body just does it.
He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome.
So what he's trying to do here is make an association. And at this time, they were coming up with the language to describe this process. But essentially what we have happening here in classical conditioning is the dog is learning to make a behavior change, right? A relatively permanent change in behavior of drooling, the drooling behavior, associating that. It used to only be associated with the reflex, the food. Now it will be associated with the metronome.
At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
Some of the first evidence of that classical conditioning happening, learning, making a permanent behavior change, based on, we can observe that behavior change over time. And so we see that because of the behavior, the drooling behavior, it is now associated with the metronome. So that is classical conditioning. So we'll talk a lot more about classical conditioning, and with that there are a lot of specific definitions here. So make sure that you take good notes about them. Make sure that you know where to find them if you say forget one of them. So the unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that already produces a response without any training. So in this case, from the dog example, that would be the food. The food is a stimulus for the response, which is the behavior. So the unconditioned response is the automatic involuntary response that's already there. So the unlearned reaction, in this case, the drool. So the conditioned stimulus, so we've got unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Now we're going to have conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. The conditioned stimulus is the stimulus that's neutral. Didn't matter, wasn't connected to anything before, was not associated. So the metronome or the bell is the conditioned stimulus. And then the conditioned response is the new behavior based on that conditioned stimulus. So that is salivating to the metronome, salivating to the bell. So unconditioned is when it's happening by itself. Then you condition it, you make that association, the learning has happened, and now you have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. All right, so acquisition is what we describe the process of learning that association. So to have associative learning happening, you make an acquisition and then you are now conditioned. And now the associative learning has happened. So lots of words with slightly different definitions here to be aware of. But think about and put in your own notes, what else might you be able to associate? What in your life have you associated with something? So you might think of phone notifications. Do you have different responses, different tones of notifications? Is your call notification something that gives you more stress than your text notification or email? I know for me, my text notification, it's usually like a friend or a family member texting me. So usually it's pretty positive response or neutral response to my text notifications versus emails. I get bills through emails. So usually my emails, or I usually get more work, right? So there's things added on to my plate when I'm getting emails. And so my text notification is different for emails, and so I associate that a little more negatively. Now, a strict behaviorist wouldn't care about those emotions. They would only care about my outside behavior. So if a strict behaviorist was watching me and my text notification goes off and I smile, that's an outside behavior they would look for. Or if my email notification goes on and I kind of sigh, that would be a behavior they would look at. But think about in your own life, so pause this for a minute and write down, what else do you have associations with? What stimulus is it? What is the process of acquisition that got it to that point? And so put it in your own notes. We'll have some more examples throughout the lecture, but right now put down a couple things that you think you have acquired a association between. So hopefully you did that. Here's another couple examples. I lived in a house that had pretty old and pretty bad plumbing, and so anytime you were in the shower, the toilet flushing or even someone running water in another part of the house would make the shower freeze or burn. So I learned an association to cringe basically anytime I heard a toilet flushing. So that is an example of an association. I have been classically conditioned for that. If you've ever heard someone say something like, "This shirt smells like my partner," that is an association. You have learned a connection between those two things, the shirt and the partner. The other day, my child said, "Hey, this store smells like grandma's house." So they have an association between that smell and their grandma's house. So advertising also usually tries to associate positive emotions with their products. So in your notes that you're taking right now, I'm going to show two different advertisements. I just want you to write down like a knee-jerk gut reaction, the vibes that it gives you. What are you getting from this ad? Is it positive? Is it negative? That kind of thing. So here's the first ad. So write down the kind of associations that you have with this ad. You can pause it to do that. Now I'm going to pull up the second ad. So write down what kind of associations you have with this ad. All right, were those associations the same? Were they different? Probably for a lot of people, they were different. You might have been a little bit grossed out by the first image, and then the second image is maybe more pleasant to you. I guess if you really hate Coca-Cola, maybe you were disgusted by both of them. That you really don't want to drink Coca-Cola, but there's summer, sun, so hopefully there you're getting some different associations from both of these. And that is the intention of a lot of advertising, to use things that you are connected to. So you have already associated, say, the warmth of summer sun, or drinking a soda while you're at the beach or something like that as a positive thing. So positive, go buy our product because it's positive, versus the first ad, take action against climate change because climate change is bad, that kind of thing. All right, so with this, we'll talk about generalization. Again, another definition. Generalization is when you expand that training that you have for one stimulus to other similar stimulus, or even stimuli that are a little bit different than the original one. So that's what this image here is about. Kid is riding their bike down the street. They get scared by a barking dog. So now on another day, even though the dog is not there, the original source of the stimuli, this is a similar enough stimuli that they are still nervous. So a similar stimuli, or even sometimes you can generalize to stimuli that aren't super close to that original stimuli. So in the dog example earlier, or the Pavlov dog example, sorry, it would be the sound of a different metronome. So it's a different clicking, maybe a clicking of a clock rather than a metronome. Similar enough that you might see the dogs behave the same way. That means they have generalized to that sound. And this is different than discrimination. Discrimination is when you can distinguish between the stimuli. So in this image, the kid wouldn't be nervous around the house because the dog's not actually there, if they were discriminating between those stimuli. It would be if the Pavlov's dogs were drooling at the metronome, but they wouldn't drool at a clock. That would be an example of that. So here you are responding just to the conditioned stimulus and not to something similar to that conditioned stimulus. All right, another couple definitions. Extinction is basically when the behavior disappears. So that conditioning, so that association just doesn't happen enough for you. So you were conditioned for the metronome and the food, but it doesn't happen. You hear the metronome and you don't get food. Eventually that behavior that you had of drooling will just go away. It'll disappear. So behaviorists thought spontaneous recovery was a very strange thing. The conditioned response sometimes would just reemerge with no warning, and they wondered why that was. But again, a strict behaviorist doesn't care about what's going on in the brain. What's probably going on there, in most cases, is that they had a memory network of neurons, something else was triggering that memory network, and so ran that behavior again, essentially. So, but again, in the past, a strict behaviorist wouldn't have cared about those inner workings. It's only up until recently that we care more about those aspects. So we also have classical conditioning in humans. So little Albert is an example of classical conditioning in humans. We'll watch a little bit of this video, but I also want you to think about, what are your own experiences? What are you classically conditioned for? So are there anything that you have conditioning that you are associating with things? So put those in your notes. So this was one of the first times we got clear evidence that yes, humans can be classically conditioned. It might seem like a common sense thing. Yes, of course, we can learn by association, but in science, you still have to test those common sense things. You have to test to make sure that your theory is correct, or that this hypothesis, you're trying to falsify that hypothesis, you're trying to falsify the theory. It's not until we do that that we actually have the data to know for sure. And I'll give another example of this after this video.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
So I'll skip through a little bit. They show a bunch of different animals. Here's the actual rat. So they thought that behavior showed that the baby was not afraid of these different animals. Next, what they did, and they do describe this in the video, but they don't actually show it, they took a metal pole behind little Albert's head and they smashed it with a hammer. So they made a really, really loud sound right behind little Albert every time they put out the rat. And so they conditioned little Albert to be afraid of the white rats. After that, they tested, is little Albert afraid of white rats? So we'll see that now.
Then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through.
Sorry, a little further forward.
In this next film sequence, expected that little Albert's conditioned fear.
Well, a little bit further back, right about there.
The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
I do want to show you this last one. It is definitely the scariest of them, Watson wearing a mask. I think it'd be very, very appropriate to be scared of this person in a mask coming at you like that. So with that being said, this was a piece of evidence showing that humans could be classically conditioned. Again, this seems like common sense, but we don't know if it's actually true unless we test it. So we'll see some other examples of observational learning later with the Bobo doll. But with that, one of the things it discusses in there is people's assumptions about aggression. One thing people assume about aggression is that if you punch a pillow, you will be able to calm down. Like if you're really angry, just take it out on a pillow. Punch that pillow, punch a punching bag. That actually doesn't decrease your stress hormones or your stress overall just by itself, right? If you do a big workout and then after the workout you can calm down, but while you are doing, say, like punching a pillow, you are actually still charged up. Those stress hormones are still there. It doesn't actually calm you down. So, but again, it was common sense. If you punch a pillow, it'll calm you down. But we tested, actually that wasn't the case. So this classical conditioning in humans, it seems like, yeah, we can learn by association, but we do need to test it. So think about any other examples of classical conditioning that you are aware of in your life, things like certain tones or bells or notifications on your phone that you are conditioned to. There are other ways that we use classical conditioning. One is breaking habits. We do that by counter conditioning. We might be conditioned for a stimulus being pleasant or good or something that we have a habit to do, and then we can make it not a positive association. So for nail biting, you could put some bitter nail polish, like a gross tasting nail polish on your nails. Then if you try to bite those nails, you might stop biting those nails because it tastes gross, and you now are conditioned that biting your nails tastes gross. So, or if you are like me when I was a kid and sucking my thumb, and my parents tried that to make me stop sucking my thumb, I just kept doing it until the paint was worn off, and then I could suck my thumb again. So you might have a kid that's that persistent. Another example of how we actually do this is there are drugs that you can take that would make it so if you used something like, say, cocaine or heroin, you would feel incredibly nauseous. So you take this additional medicine, then if you use the drug that you're trying to break the habit from, you might feel super, super nauseous. So you are now reconditioning yourself to it being a not positive thing anymore. All right, with that, this is also called aversive conditioning. So a nausea-inducing substance can prevent that nail biting. So you are conditioning with an aversive thing. All right, a lot of the mindless behaviors that we do as humans are often caused by classical conditioning. So you might look at your phone anytime you hear a notification, even if you know you don't have to look at your phone, or if you know it's actually your friend's notification that just sounds a lot like yours. I always check my pockets as I'm standing up. It's something I've done for a long time, and it's classically conditioned now. So if you ever open your phone, do you go to a specific app first? A lot of our mindless behaviors come from classical conditioning. So we associate doing one thing with doing another thing. For me, I often open Reddit when I open my phone, and it's a great time waster. So, but a lot of these are happening because we have networks of neurons that are really good at doing that process. You can think of it as like a default program in your brain. That it's really easy to trigger, it's really easy to run. Your brain does this habit, does this behavior all the time with very low effort. And that's good for our brains to learn to do things easily, like say speaking. It's a lot easier to speak or use fine motor control now as an adult than it was when you were a younger child. So neurons that are used a lot need less energy to activate. They learn that they are used so much, so it takes less energy to actually activate them, which also means it's easier to trigger those mindless habits. If the habit's no problem, then there's no problem. But if the habit is problematic, then it can be hard to break that habit. All right, another example of classical conditioning is exposure therapy. Exposure therapy in pure classical conditioning is just putting something in and pairing it with another thing and just exposing to the thing for a time. But now for exposure therapy, we often do this for things like trauma. We often do it for fears and phobias, and we usually use cognitive behavioral therapy. So we add the cognitive piece to the pure behaviorism. So I want to show a couple pieces of this video. We won't watch the whole thing. Feel free to watch the whole thing if you would like. Essentially, exposure therapy, if you go to a therapist today and you say, I have a fear of snakes, they will help you work with that over the course of a couple months. Every session, you'll spend some time on it, that kind of thing. This is a different tested method where the researchers thought, well, why don't we get rid of their fear in a day? Like have a really big 6-hour session of exposure therapy, get rid of the fear, they can leave in a day, and they no longer have that fear. That could be useful for some people. Maybe they want to just get rid of it quickly. Maybe they don't have time to be coming back to the therapist multiple times. So depending on who it is, they might like that method. So in this video, we will see a person who is very, very afraid of snakes and some of the processes that they go through in this exposure therapy. Essentially, they are conditioning themselves that the snake is okay. It's not going to kill them, that the snake is all right, that they're making a new association. Right here at the beginning, you'll see their behavior towards the end, and then what they were like at the very beginning.
Meet 22-year-old Mariam Doom from Venezuela, clinical psychologist Lars Göran Erst from Sweden, and Alf. He's an American corn snake. This multinational threesome is working together. Mariam helps out when Alf gets tangled in Erst's belt loops, and Erst helps Mariam put Alf around her neck. The picture looks simple enough, unless you go back in time, just 3 hours ago, as Mariam was preparing to meet Alf for the first time. Mariam has a specific phobia, a fear of snakes.
So there you could see in the video that her reaction to the snake is really dramatic. She is very afraid of the snake. It wasn't super clear from there, but the therapist with the snake is standing about 15 feet away from her, maybe 20 feet away from her, and holding the snake. The snake isn't just on the ground, like I've paused it right here. So I want to give you a sense of a little bit of the process. Since we're adding the cognition here, the cognitive part is talking about the person's fears, the person's feelings, and the main thing that she's fearing is that if the snake is loose and she can't get away from it, that she will have a heart attack because she is so afraid of it. So she really thinks she will die if there is a snake in here. So they work through that fear. They talk about why that is not a reasonable expectation and try to talk about how to respond to the snake. And they plan out beforehand all the steps that they will take in shaping a new behavior. So essentially they'll start far away, The snake will be held until she wants it to be released. They'll come closer and closer and closer, and maybe she'll be able to touch the snake, that kind of thing. So it's a planned thing versus if it was pure exposure therapy, strict behaviorist style, you might throw a person in a room with a snake and just hope for the best, and it could possibly work with enough exposure. But that's why the cognitive piece is such a good thing to add. So let's see a little bit into the process as she's been working with the snake for a little while.
Catastrophic belief can't occur unless Erst releases the snake.
I'm not doing that.
After 15 minutes, Erst sits down. Some anxiety returns.
Try to breathe slowly and calmly and with your stomach.
She calms down.
So, what about the name for it? And where are you going?
I'm going to move here.
Okay. What do you think it feels like?
This is it's a nice snake.
Her anxiety is down.
30, great. You're sitting about, what is this, 3 meters away?
She decides to approach.
Okay, I'm going to approach you. I'm going to approach you.
Yeah, good.
But hold it.
Yeah.
Looks like
All right, so from this, we can see how we get from being absolutely terrified to some of what we saw at the very beginning, where she was more likely to interact with the snake, even at the very end, touching the snake, these kinds of things. And that was the cognitive plus the behavioral. So she is exposed to this stimuli, the snake, and over this time of being exposed, the cognitive piece is helping, realizing that she's not going to die, that it's okay. The snake's okay. It's not caring about her, that kind of thing. So another interesting example of classical conditioning that's pretty unique to some animals is taste aversions. So it's a special case of classical conditioning where you only need to pair the stimulus one time with nausea. So you pair a taste with nausea. And the reason this acquisition is so quick, well, take a minute, think about why would it be useful for some animals to, say, have nausea paired with some certain taste with just one time of being conditioned. Essentially, this is a survival reflex. We have this built into our genetics that we can very quickly develop a taste aversion to something that might be poisonous, something that might be spoiled. It would be really bad if we had to eat a poison food like 5 times before we actually learned that this is bad for us. So there's some genetic components building this to happen. And a taste aversion, interestingly, also can happen when it wasn't actually the food that caused the nausea. So some examples from students in my class are that they ate some dinner and then they had the flu that night. So they got sick from a viral infection and they threw up some of that food. Now they have a taste aversion to that food that they ate at dinner, whatever it might be. A similar thing happened to me with the candy on the screen. So this is a payday. It's basically just caramel and salted peanuts. And I used to eat them a lot, but one day after I ate it, I was sick. I don't know. I doubt it was the candy bar that caused the food poisoning, but it was essentially food poisoning. I was throwing up a few hours after eating the candy bar, and it went away by the next morning, essentially. So with that, since then, paydays seem terrible. Like even kind of looking at it on my screen right now, after I've just eaten lunch, actually, it's making me a little bit nauseous. So since then, I did steal one of my candies from one of my kids' payday last Halloween. So that was about 3, maybe even like 6 years since I developed the taste aversion. So it's been a while, but I have eaten one since then, and it was tough. I kind of had to force it down, but I didn't throw up again. If I wanted to, if it was actually important, I could do some exposure therapy to get over this taste aversion. Eventually, they do get weaker and go away, or they can as well. But yeah, taste aversions are a really interesting thing where we can get classically conditioned just one time. So if you have a taste aversion, a great thing to put in your notes as an example of classical conditioning. So let's watch an other video of conditioning, I think we'll watch the one with the chicken and the clicker training before we talk about operant conditioning. We won't watch the whole video either. So essentially what this is saying is they are trying to get the chicken to discriminate between one sticker that it's supposed to peck and another sticker that it's not supposed to peck.
Last time someone came back again, yeah, all the way from Australia. Come back here.
So this is not the one the chicken is supposed to peck. It is supposed to be pecking this sticker. And essentially, every time it pecks that sticker, it immediately gets its food, and you can hear the click. Clicker training is essentially associating the food with the clicker. This is a really good way to help train animals, because sometimes you want to give them a reinforcement really, really quickly, but they have to maybe finish a couple steps before you can actually give them, say, their treat, like their food. So in this process, they're both helping the chicken discriminate between these two stickers and associate the click with the food. So in the future, the click will be like the metronome. The click will be a reinforcer for the chicken all by itself. So I like hearing that chicken getting a little mad from the process, that it's not getting its reinforcement when it thinks it should be getting its reinforcement. Makes me think of training velociraptors in the recent Jurassic Park movies as well. So we'll use this as an example and a bunch of other examples as we get into operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is an example of conditioning where the organism or the human or the dog has to be active and then gets a consequence. So it's still getting that conditioning process. It's still getting that association between two things. But in this case, the individual is active, is part of the process, and then gets a consequence because of what kind of behavior they're doing. Versus with classical conditioning, the stimulus and the response are just happening at the same time. So you're getting repetitions of that versus here, operant conditioning, you are an operator, you are doing something. And so that is what changes things. It's active. The future behavior is based on that consequence. This is where we get the terms reinforcement and punishment from. Reinforcement makes it more likely that you'll do the same behavior again versus a punishment, you are less likely to do that same behavior again. So this is a Skinner box. It's a nice little box to put rats in where you can electrify the floor for punishments. You can have food come in for reinforcements. You can give them instructions with little lights and a speaker. They can push on a lever, push on buttons. It's a way that we can, in a very controlled environment, see what kinds of patterns of behaviors rats can learn through punishment and reinforcement. So before we get into the punishments and the reinforcements and some examples of them, just so you know, we found with many animals, including humans, that punishments are not as good of a way to learn new behaviors as reinforcements. Reinforcements always work better to learn behaviors and maintain them for longer. So shaping is the process of getting to a far off behavior, essentially. So you have an end goal of what you want someone to do or something to do, and you have to train it in steps. So for this dog, you might need to train a service dog to help you do laundry. You might need to train a service dog to be able to get supplies out of a fridge or to open your medicine, like find your medicine in a cupboard, open it, give you medicine, right? There's multiple steps in each of those behaviors. So for the laundry example, you might first reinforce the dog, give it a reward for carrying clothes. And then after that, you stop giving it a reward just for carrying clothes. They only get the reward when they carry the clothes all the way to the laundry room. But then after they get pretty good at that, you then only give them a reward when they put the clothes into the washing machine. So that would be an example of a couple steps to shape the behavior of the dog doing the laundry. So with this, hopefully you can see that this is very similar. This is the same as the zone of proximal development. So what the dog can't do yet is laundry, but what it can do is pick up clothes. What it can do with help is maybe take the clothes to a specific spot. So then it will expand its zone of proximal development. So this zone of proximal development, the socio-emotional learning theory, does kind of absorb this behavioral learning theory as well. But with that, we use reinforcements a lot. Star chart is a good example of a reinforcement, but reinforcements are a consequence that increases the likelihood of the behavior. So it's a really specific definition. The consequence is making it likely that the behavior will happen again. So a kid might really like a star chart. That might be reinforcing. Getting a star might make it more likely that they will do that behavior again. One of my kids loves a star chart. They have a star chart. They use it very regularly. My other child does not like the star chart. They couldn't care less about it. So for the child that doesn't care at all about the star chart, it is not a reinforcement. It does not increase the likelihood of them doing a behavior. So another example, spicy food. Some people really love spicy food. Some people really hate spicy food. If you are a person who loves spicy food, if I give you some spicy candy for doing well on a test, it might make you a little more likely to do the studying behavior before the test. Versus if you hate spicy food, it might not be reinforcing. You might say, well, I don't want that again. In that kind of case, hopefully you still do the studying and just tell me, no, give me something else, not a spicy candy. So praise may or may not be reinforcing. The thing about a reinforcement or a punishment is that you have to find what the individual needs. What is their, you could say, their currency. It could be currency. What is the thing that they want? What is reinforcing to them? Because again, maybe spicy is reinforcing to some, but not all. Maybe to some, spicy is punishing. So a punishment, again, a very specific definition, is a consequence that decreases the likelihood of that behavior happening again. So some things might be punishing to some people and not other people. And again, punishments don't work as well for training new behaviors and keeping those behaviors longer lasting. Reinforcements do work better, but punishments have been used in training and teaching as well. So with that, again, reinforcement is a consequence that increases the likelihood of the behavior happening. Punishment decreases the likelihood of the behavior happening. So it's not necessarily one person's reinforcement might be another person's punishment and vice versa. So as we talk about operant conditioning here, think of positive and negative like addition and subtraction in math. So when I say positive, think just like a plus sign, and negative, think of a minus sign, because that's what it is. Positive is adding something to a situation. Negative subtracts it or takes it away from the situation. So this is an important point to make clear before the next slide, where we're talking about positive reinforcement and positive punishment. Positive in this case is not a value judgment. It's not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. So the positive is not like this is really great, or negative is this is really bad. Positive is I have added something. Negative is I have subtracted something. I have taken something away. So let's keep that in mind as we see the next examples. So a positive reinforcement is something that adds to the situation and makes it so the behavior has the potential to increase. So you're adding something to the situation and it increases the chance of the behavior happening again. So again, maybe a spicy candy would be a positive reinforcement. I'm adding a candy to the situation. I'm giving you a candy, it's added to the situation, and now you're more likely to do the thing I want you to do. A positive punishment is when you add something to the situation that decreases the likelihood of a behavior. So this picture here of yelling at a dog, yelling at the dog, yelling at a kid, adding that yelling is a positive thing, right? It's adding, positive addition. You're adding something to the situation. You're adding the yelling. So a positive punishment of yelling at a dog is an example here. So it's to decrease the behavior of gnawing on the shoe. Another example of a positive punishment is spanking a child. You are adding a spank to the situation. Again, this is not a value judgment. This is not saying spanking is good. Spanking is actually pretty bad. It can harm children quite a bit. So it's a bad thing to do. but it is a positive punishment because you are adding the spank to the situation in order to decrease some behavior. Maybe the child was gnawing on the shoe, and so you spank the child. That would be a positive punishment. You're adding the spank to the situation to decrease the behavior of gnawing on the shoe. All right, so again, going back to that previous slide, positive and negative, it's addition and subtraction just like math. It is not value judgment. It's not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. Right? So positive reinforcement is something that you put into the situation that makes it more likely that the behavior will happen again. Positive punishment, something you put into a situation and makes it less likely that the behavior will happen again. All right, so those tend to be a little easier to think of examples, like adding something to the situation, like adding a yell, adding a candy, adding money would be a positive reinforcement. These kinds of, or could be a positive reinforcement. Negative is sometimes harder to think of. So a negative reinforcement is when you remove something from the situation and your intention is to increase the behavior. Negative punishment, on the other hand, you're removing something from the situation to decrease the behavior. So an example of negative reinforcement, you could say that, oh, I just had one in my mind. Usually negative reinforcement is the hardest one for students to like grab onto, and it can seem similar to positive punishment. So just be careful with the examples that you say, think of and look up. I've seen a lot of examples online on, say, even other researcher and professors' pages that aren't actually getting a negative reinforcement. A good example here is my kids were arguing the other day. The older child did not like the, oh no, it was the younger child did not like the older child singing. It was very annoying to them. They wanted them to stop and they started fighting about it because the singing was at like an appropriate volume for the house. They were in the living room. It's like that's a room that people can be in, you know, that kind of thing. So but they were annoyed with the singing. So I said, hey, a behavior you could do is go to your room. You can remove yourself from the situation. They did that. They went to their own room. Like I wasn't like grounding them or saying, you have to go to your room. I was saying one way to solve this problem, you could go to your room. You could remove yourself from the situation. And that increased the likelihood that they would do that behavior in the future because they did have a fun time in their room. They played Legos. They were reading books. They were having a good time versus they were arguing. They were not having a good time. So that is a negative reinforcement. Something has been removed from the situation. Another example there might be they could ask their sibling. They could say, hey, would you please stop singing? And so there, if the singing stopped, maybe their behavior next time would be to ask to stop the singing politely. Right? They've removed something and it increased the chances that they would ask politely for the singing to stop. So that's negative reinforcement. It can be a hard one. Another kind of funny example, if you have pretty stinky breath, you remove the bacteria in your mouth, and now you are more likely to do that in the future because the people around you like talking to you and are more willing to come closer to your face. So that's another example of a negative reinforcement. All right, so negative punishment, again, is when you take something out of the situation, but punishment decreases the likelihood of the behavior. So this funny picture here of the person taking the bone from the dog. If the dog did something naughty that you didn't want it to do, you can take away its bone and hopefully it won't do it anymore. Right, so this is often something you do with, say, children. You might take away their screen time. You might take away their video game. So taking something out of the situation to decrease the behavior. I've got a funny story for this one too. This one was me. I was the kid, probably 9, maybe 10 years old, definitely old enough to know better. I had a bow and arrow, and my brother had a bow and arrow. We decided it would be a really fun game to shoot the arrows into the sky and catch them on the way down. They were sharp. They had points. It wasn't like a suction cup. It was a practice training arrow that you generally use. It's not like a broadhead with razor blades, but still a sharp point that could really harm someone. So we're shooting them up into the air, and my mom came and took them away from us. I literally never saw the bow and arrow again. So it seems to have disappeared in one of the times we moved. But because that was a negative punishment, it was taking that bow and arrow out of the situation, and that decreased the behavior of me shooting arrows into the sky. So a really good example there of negative punishment. All right, so positive reinforcement, you add something like a candy to a situation. It's to increase the chances of the behavior. Positive punishment, you yell at the dog, you're adding the yell, hoping to decrease the chance of the behavior. Negative reinforcement, you remove something from the situation, and that increases the likelihood of the behavior. So you ask someone to please stop the loud sound, they stop the loud sound. You're more likely to ask nicely again next time. Negative punishment, you take something away from the situation, and that decreases the likelihood of the behavior. So you take my bow and arrow away, it decreases the likelihood that I will poke my eye out with the arrow. All right, so this is something that students can get confused on, positive punishment versus negative reinforcement. Do be careful if you're looking up examples online of these. In any case, for most of the things that you will want to do just in day-to-day life, oftentimes positive reinforcements are easier, right? Positive reinforcements, adding something to the situation is a little easier to think of, to like give a reward, basically. You could think of it that way. So do be careful with looking up those kinds of examples. There's a couple other examples, negative and positive reinforcement. Feel free to pause. I believe this one's in your book, though. Here's a funny one from The Simpsons. So kind of similar to our tooth example. Negative reinforcement, the house is smelly. You remove the trash from the house. Now it's not smelly anymore. Everybody's happy. So you have been negatively reinforced. Here's a positive reinforcement. You're studying for a test. You do really good on the test. And everybody is happy. So you've been positively reinforced for your studying behavior. Here is positive punishment and negative punishment. So Bart has been skateboarding in the school hallways. So you could give the positive punishment, make them write a bunch of words on the board. Probably you should have them write, "I will not skate in the hallway," or something like that. And that is adding something to the situation that you hope decreases the skateboarding in the hallways behavior. Or you could do a negative punishment. You take away the skateboard in hopes that it will decrease the skateboarding in hallways behavior in the future. So consider what kinds of reinforcements or punishments might be happening in this scenario. So pause the video, write down anything you can think of who is getting positively reinforced, who is getting negatively reinforced, who's getting punished in these situations. All right, the kids here are getting a positive reinforcement if the dad stops. If the dad stops, their screaming behavior will be reinforced. They will be more likely to do that screaming behavior in the future. It is also, if the dad stops, it is also a negative reinforcement for dad. He did the behavior of taking them to the place, and it stopped the screaming. It removed the screaming from his car. So he is negatively reinforced to be more likely to stop the next time. But it is also a positive punishment for the father as well. The yelling is hoping to decrease the driving behavior. The kids don't want the driving behavior to continue, so they are yelling. They're adding something to the situation to punish the dad and hopefully decrease the driving behavior. So with that, each of these will end up, if you do stop, it will teach you and the children to do that again, to do the screaming until the dad stops the car again. All right, next thing is schedules of reinforcement. So we talked about specific reinforcements like giving a candy, right? Giving a coin, giving a toy to someone, giving a star on a star chart. These are examples of reinforcement, but when should you give those things? When should you give the reinforcement? That is what schedules of reinforcement are all about. So we'll go through each one of these, starting with variable ratio on the left. A variable ratio is around, a ratio specifically is about the number of times the behavior happens. So it's a variable number of times the behavior happens. So you might reinforce someone on average every 3 times they do something. So the other day, my youngest was reading on the couch instead of doing a screen or chasing the cat around the house. So I gave them a candy as a reinforcement. I could do that every single time, but a variable ratio would be every about 3 times. I would give them a candy for doing that. So this time it might actually be 4, the next time it might be 2, then 3, then 2, then 4. So it's around an average of every 3 times. This is the most resistant to extinction, so the behavior tends to stay the longest with variable ratio. Usually you are giving the reinforcement immediately or as close to immediately after the behavior as you can. So if it's around an average of 3, it might be right after the 4th behavior, or right after the 2nd behavior, or right after the 3rd behavior. Fixed ratio, on the other hand, is every 3 times. And that one is a pretty easy pattern to start to remember and guess. And so it's a little more able to go into extinction than variable. With variable, you're a little more used to going a little bit more span of time before you get your reinforcement. But for fixed, you know it's coming every 3 times. Every 3 times I read, then I will get the reward or the candy. So that is fixed ratio. It's a fixed number of times. So similarly, variable over here and fixed interval, these are around a time period. So not a number of times, but a time period, but it's still the same variable versus fixed. So variable time period would be around every 3 days. So on average, every 3 days, I will give my child a candy if they have read a book. So if at any time in those previous 3 days, they have read the book, they will get the reinforcement. So again, it's around that average. So it might be 2 days, then it might be 4 days, then it might be 3 days, then it might be 4 days again, or 2 days again, right? So if that behavior happened during that interval, they will get the reinforcement. So you can see you don't learn things as quickly with variable interval, but sometimes this is how you have to do things, right? Depending on the situation, also depending on the kind of behavior, you might want a slower, steady increase. Fixed interval is one that probably a lot of you are pretty familiar with. So a lot of people get paid every 2 weeks. That is a fixed interval of a reinforcement. Every 2 weeks, if you were at work, during any time in that past 2 weeks, even if it wasn't on payday, you might not have worked on payday, you might have worked a couple days before that, but you still get paid on those points. That's fixed interval. So for the example of the reading, it might be every single 3 days. So as we come up to the 3rd day, if at any point in that 3 days my child read, I give them a candy. And you can see here from the graph, oftentimes organisms will do the behavior more and more and more, right up to the point where they know that interval is coming. So my child won't read the 1st day, maybe he'll read the 2nd day, and then we'll definitely read the 3rd day, maybe even a couple books the 3rd day to make sure I see it. So then they get their reward. And then they kind of don't read for a couple days and then make sure they read right before they get their reward, right before I check in on them. So each of these leads to different patterns of behavior. You might want the pattern of behavior for whatever you're training from a fixed interval, right? If you want something to last, use either the variable ratio or variable interval. Those are the two that are the most resistant to extinction, and variable ratio is the best of them all for staying long-lasting learning. All of these are used in applied behavioral analysis. Applied behavioral analysis has been around for a long time. You might have heard it as ABA therapy, and it essentially is using behaviorism and reinforcement schedules to teach new behaviors. Therapists will create a plan and a schedule for a client to learn some new skill. So for example, if you were starting to teach a child, to read, if you wanted a child to read more, you might use applied behavioral analysis to reinforce them when they do their reading or their homework. If you have just taught them an anger management technique and you want them to practice it, you can give them a reinforcement after they practice it, right? A 14-year-old, if they're making it to school on time, maybe you give them a reinforcement. I had a client who was 17 and soon was hoping to be able to get a job and move out of the house, but really didn't want to do the application process. It stressed them out. They had a hard time with it. So I set up a reinforcement schedule with applied behavioral analysis. Essentially, their reinforcement was that they would get to play, like during our sessions, they would get to play video games for X number of minutes. So if during that time they did a step towards applying to places, whether it was actually downloading an app or like starting an application, downloading it, looking up more information for the company, tailoring their resume, like any of those kinds of behaviors around searching for a job, if they did that, they would get a reinforcement of being able to play video games during the session that we were having. So ABA therapy can be a really effective way to learn specific skills, especially if it's hard. You can do this for your own self. If you know you have a hard time reading the chapter or something like that, you could give yourself a reinforcement schedule that says every single page, I will give myself a fixed ratio of every page read, I get a candy. So you can use ABA therapy on yourself. That being said, ABA therapy does have criticisms being thrown at it right now, especially because a lot of the therapists that have used it have tried not just to teach specific skills, but have used it with neurodiverse children to try and make them seem more neurotypical, basically to try and make that person not the same person that they are, but the kind of person that the therapist or maybe the parents even want them to be. And that's not an ethical use of the method. It is a very effective teaching method for teaching specific skills, but it is not appropriate to try and use it to change who people are. So there is a range of the appropriate use of it. So you've got appropriate use and you've got very inappropriate use over here. So any given therapist that you find might be somewhere along that spectrum. So hopefully if you are working with any therapists that are doing ABA, they are using it in an ethical way to help teach specific things like skills, rather than to try and change a person who doesn't need to be changed. Neurodiverse people are people as well. Their brains should also be respected and be treated with respect and care and concern, just like any other human. All right, so we've seen now the Ninja the Rat video, the Crystal the Rat video, and the chicken training video. The next video that we will watch is actually this Bobo doll experiment. And this is the experiment that looks at observational learning.
The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic.
Trying to pause it with the kid and the the Bobo doll in the same shot, but that's okay. I think we've got a picture of it in the slides anyway, so maybe I'll just scroll back to that picture in, oh, there we go. Yep, picture in the slides. So this example was another one of those that seems like common sense. Well, of course people can learn by observation, but again, in science, you have to test that. You have to falsify that hypothesis to see if that is actually a appropriate kind of claim. So with this study, essentially you took half of the kids and they watched the adult be really violent and hurting the, well, I mean, not really hurting, it's a toy, but being violent towards the toy. The other half, they did other things with the toy. They dressed it up, they did a tea party, they did like hide and seek, like other things that were not violent. So from that, then they let the kids in the room. And in the group that saw them playing nice things with the doll, did not see the violent behavior, there were still a few kids who were violent towards the toy. But it was like 12 or something percent. It was quite low, versus in the group that saw the violence towards the toy, there was more like 70% of those kids were violent towards the toy as well. So it goes to show, yes, humans can learn through observation. We can actually learn a whole lot of things through observation. We can learn new knowledge, we can learn new skills. So new knowledge about a subject. Oftentimes you learn how to, for example, in the classes where I teach how to find research papers, I go through and show in the library resources how to find the research papers. So new knowledge, new skills as well of how to find research papers and then how to read research papers. You can watch someone do a skateboard trick to try and help learn how to do that. You can learn new strategies for things and new attitudes as well. A lot of people's attitudes in general come from the people around them. They observe what other people think and feel about things, and they oftentimes, not always, stick with those things. You'll often find adolescents, in adolescence, they will have similar views politically or religiously to their parents versus after they're out of the house. Now they've observed other things or been exposed to more ideas. They might have different attitudes than their parents at that point, as a fairly common thing that happens. So we can learn a lot through observational learning. But with observational learning, mirror neurons play a big role. If you remember our chapter on neurons in general, the mirror neurons are ones that fire specifically when observing another human doing an action. So even though you might not be doing the movement for, say, a skateboard trick, your body is kind of pre-running those in the neurons in your brain. So it's a good way to help us start to learn through observation. So how do we learn through observation? One is focused attention. So this takes cognitive ability. It takes you actually focusing your attention on something. If you are not paying attention, you're not going to learn it. It's not going to stick in your mind. Retention is remembering what you observed. So making connections with it. If you have absolutely never seen skateboarding before, if you've never tried something like that, it's going to be really hard to connect it to other things, right? So there are things you can do to make that easier, like repetition, things like that. Another thing is that as you do observational learning, you can also use operant conditioning or classical conditioning to train and help remember and help reward and condition the learning. So you could give yourself direct reinforcements for things. So if you observe something, then you tried it out. Maybe you observed someone playing a chord on a guitar, you tried it out yourself by positioning your fingers the correct way, then you could give yourself a reinforcement. There is also vicarious reinforcement. If the model that you're watching gets punished or reinforced, that will help teach you, yes, I should do that, or no, I shouldn't do that. So going back to my funny example of shooting arrows into the sky, if my brother had seen me do that and get hurt, that would have been a vicarious punishment. He probably would not have tried it if he had seen me get hurt. So versus vicarious reinforcement, if your neighbor in your classroom is doing more studying, is reading books, is taking better notes than you, and then they get a better grade on the test, you might see that as vicarious reinforcement and try to do those behaviors as well. So humans are not the only creatures that can learn from observation. So chimps can learn from observation, orcas can, and also dolphins, crows, and also octopuses or octopi. So let's watch this really interesting video of octopi learning through observation. So I got another copyright strike on my video as I uploaded it. This is so strange because I have used this video, recorded it for other schools before, uploaded it. I have a video on my YouTube channel right now with this in it in a lecture format. But this octopus video, I have a copyright strike from it, which is really funny because someone actually, the video on YouTube is someone who took their phone camera, looked and is filming their own screen from a news report or whatever it is. So anyway, point is, click on the other video, on the video linked in the slides, or it might be in the same place where you found the lecture recording link as well. So watch the original video, and then in a couple seconds, I will do a follow-up on the video. So go click that actual link, watch the video. It is very interesting to see what the octopus can do. So in that video, we see an octopus learning through observation. I would hate to be the crab there. That's pretty scary. I already have thalassophobia, so like fear of things underwater. And so this is already terrifying enough. The crab is having a very bad day there, but it's a really interesting fact that other animals can learn through observation. So like I mentioned before the video, crows have been seen to learn through observation. So have chimps. Orcas have been seen to learn through observation. So they also can learn games and things like that. So it is pretty amazing the things that we're able to learn also through observation. So besides these forms of learning, more recently we've studied other forms of learning as well. So we've gone all the way from strict behaviorism, where it's just conditioning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. We've got observational learning, but also there's purposive behavior. We can learn because of other cognitive factors, because we want to, because we're interested in something. That can be a way that we learn as well. In this, we have to do self-regulation. So if this person wants to build this model boat, it is very complicated. So there's probably times when they break things, or they're going too fast or too slow for what they're trying to do, or they're frustrated, so they have to regulate their emotions. They might have to not like bounce their knee or something if they have a habit of that. They have to set a goal of, I want to get X, Y, and Z done today and then more done the next day. They have to monitor themselves as well. I have to say, okay, I am getting these pieces straight, I'm getting the colors right, or I'm getting them wrong, that kind of thing. With this purposive behavior, we can learn also through mentors. So mentors can help us within that zone of proximal development. Mentors can help reinforce us. Also, mentors can give us quick feedback on our behavior. Some things can give us quick feedback. We can understand pretty quickly, but it can also be very helpful to have that outside person giving us some monitoring feedback. So if you're, say, an apprentice or you're an assistant or something like that, and you have someone teaching you or training you, that can be incredibly helpful. Also, we have latent learning. So both humans as well as other animals can learn in ways that are not reinforced, that we don't even realize we've learned until we have to use it. So latent learning is a good example of this is here on the slide. So if you just let rats, so let's say you take 100 rats. For 50 of them, you give 50 of them a chance just to play in the maze for 15 minutes. So those 50 rats, over the couple days, you get them all 15 minutes to play in a maze. And then after that, you try to reinforce all of the rats to learn the maze. The rats who just played in the maze have latent learning. They know some of their way around the maze already, and they will learn quicker than the rats who have never seen the maze before. So humans do this too. Humans might pick things up that don't come up till later. A lot of parenting behaviors that parents do are actually learned latently from the way their parents behaved as well. So, and then sometimes it can be hard for parents to behave differently towards their children than their parents parented them. And so there's a lot of cases where we do learn things, even though we're not realizing that it's learned, that it is there in our brain, it's making networks, but we might not be using it yet. Another really neat example for humans especially is insight learning. Insight learning is when we suddenly come up with an out-of-the-box idea. So something, put things together in a unique or creative way. It's problem solving. It's that light bulb moment. It's that sudden insight or understanding. So this is something that humans can do. This can come from things like latent learning, putting together things that we've learned directly through reinforcement or modeling and observational learning. But this insight is just putting things together in a new, unique way. And so you can work on that kind of creativity to improve it intentionally. Doing essentially anything to build creativity can help with insight learning. But interestingly, also experience with other cultures can improve your insight learning. So whether if you are in a multicultural family, a multicultural area, if you spend a lot of time with people of other cultures, seeing how other people do things and solve problems can help you break out of the patterns and habits and networks that you have and be more flexible in how you approach problems. You might put things together in a new, unique way. This is actually one of the big things with experts in a field because they've worked in an area for so long, they know a lot about it. It makes it really easy for them as they learn about another field to start putting insights from there together with their field. One of my professors, Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, he would always talk to us about the other conferences that he went to that were not psychology focused. He was a positive psychologist, one of the fathers of the field of positive psychology. And after he would go to a conference for once, it was a genetics conference. He came back to it, and genetics is closer related to psychology than some of the things he told us about. But he had new ideas for how to incorporate, whether it be methods that they were using or ideas that they were talking about, and the way that they were thinking about problems and applying it to things in psychology. So that's just still academia, an academic looking at other academics doing things. But if you have a person that, say, studies abroad, that can be a way to experience a culture. Moving to another place, even smaller vacations can have an impact, but really experience with those other cultures, other ways of doing things can really help. And speaking of cultures, culture plays a huge role in what we learn. So essentially, we don't learn things that we are not exposed to. So whether it's directly or indirectly through like a video, someone talking about their experience, we don't really learn things that we're not exposed to. So culture plays a huge role in that. And this is not just like US culture versus the culture of China or India. It can also be more unique or individual. So you might have a culture at your college. Olympic College has its own culture and the way people treat each other and interact with one another. If you're part of the military or part of the veteran community, there's different cultures there as well. You might be in a household that's already multicultural. So with that, culture plays a huge role in what we are exposed to, what we can learn from, who we can learn from. This can impact our insight learning, direct modeling, observational learning, what we are directly instructed or taught to do through reinforcement. So as the example here, a child who lives in the city of Chicago probably doesn't learn how to find edible plants. It's not relevant in the culture that that child is in, versus many other cultures, that's very important. Right? So what we are experiencing is going to go into what we are learning. So culture is a huge role there. And actually the little whale reminded me of looking back at observational learning at the orcas that have recently been, at least recent as of recording of this, have been destroying yachts. And learned that from other orcas as well. So their culture is to destroy yachts. So good job, orcas. But that goes to show that we can learn from cultures as humans, and some other animals can as well. Crows can teach each other things as well. So culture is a huge role in what we are learning and what we are exposed to. So that is the chapter on learning. Again, don't forget to check your syllabus for the next chapter in line. Depending on the semester, or sorry, depending on the quarter, that's a cultural thing here at Olympic College. Everything's called quarters rather than terms or semesters. So I'm still getting used to that cultural phenomena. Getting positively reinforced when I get it right, and honestly a little bit of positive punishment of people teasing me when I get it wrong. But with that, make sure you're looking at your syllabus to check what the next chapter you are supposed to be reading is, because that can change depending on the quarter and how the class is structured. Thanks.